Hello. I'm continuing talking about the Dhammapada, and yesterday I talked about some verses in the section on the wise one. And today I'm going to talk about some verses of the section called the Arahat or Arahat. And, well, obviously, the Arahat is somebody who has gained enlightenment. And we haven't gained enlightenment, presumably. You may have, but I know I haven't at the moment. So, why am I going to talk about verses from this? Well, I think just they're very relevant, but there's some verses in this section that are really beautiful. So it starts off, he has finished with sorrow, who has ended the round of rebirths and freed himself from all fetters. So this is interesting because in India, the teaching of rebirth is very exciting and encouraging to Buddhists in the East. And that's because to end the round of rebirth seems like a really good thing to aim for. Whereas in our culture, it possibly isn't. Do we really want to leave the rounds of rebirth? Isn't what we really want is to keep coming back, get another life, extend this one, perpetuate ourself. So this runs very deep in us, that actually, what does this mean to end the rounds of rebirth and freed himself from all fetters? So, yeah, these fetters basically are what holds us back, our negative states of mind. And, well, we're very attached to them. And, until we really see the pain that they cause us and the pain that they cause others, we don't, we hang on to them quite tightly. That's quite an interesting idea, actually, because, people would say they don't want to be anxious and they don't want to feel aversion and hatred, but actually some of those experiences have a lot of energy in them and we can cling on to them, but also they often serve a purpose. So, for example, if we're anxious, for example, we can imagine that we're going to never be caught out. We're going to keep ahead, if you like, always be vigilant so that nothing can surprise us in a way. Or it can be, a learnt behaviour that actually means that we use it as an excuse, if you like, for not acting in ways that maybe are more skillful because, we've marked ourselves as an anxious person. Whereas we can be more relaxed about it. Maybe the anxiety doesn't go away, but we don't expect it to, and we treat it as just another aspect of ourselves. Yes, so I think it's interesting that there's cultural differences between whether we actually want to leave the rounds of rebirth. And I think it's probably towards the very end of the path, towards enlightenment, that actually we genuinely do want to leave the round of rebirths, because we're very attached to pleasure and very attached to all our cravings. So the next verse says, he presses on with his thoughts controlled, never looking back to his home like a swan which has left its pool. He presses on with his thoughts controlled, never looking back to his home like a swan which has left its pool. Yeah, it's quite interesting, this one. I was thinking how, a lot of the pain we cause ourselves is because we do look back. We have regrets. We find it very difficult to let go of pleasant situations. Maybe... I remember when I was younger and when I first started going to Crete. And towards the end of the holiday, sort of sadness would come over me, and I would think, I hope in the future that I'm going to be able to see this again, experience this again, and yes, that there would be there would be quite a lot of pain really in holding on, wanting that experience just to continue. So never looking back, it's like, yes, it's that non-clinging, not having regrets, and if we act ethically, then we won't have regrets in the future. So his thoughts controlled. Yeah, I think the word control is another word that's not terribly popular today. But in a way, we do have to make decisions about what we feed our mind with. As I often say, we're feeding our mind all the time, just as we're feeding our body. And we're usually much more concerned with what we put in our body. Maybe we want organic foods and we don't want too much sugar and we don't want too much fat and so on. And we'll look at the ingredients and study them and so on. But actually, we can be pretty careless about what we feed our mind with. And that's because there's an awful lot of words around and images around. They're everywhere. They wouldn't have been 2,500 years ago. In the days of the Buddha, they wouldn't have. It wouldn't have been like that. You wouldn't have had. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Any of the media, but most people didn't write anyway. They couldn't write, so you wouldn't have had graffiti and you wouldn't have had advertisements. So, how can we control our thoughts? Well, basically by not feeding our minds with a load of rubbish. So taking care with what we read, what we look at on the internet, false information. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment. Making choices, making informed choices about what we feed our mind with. I think that's really important. So the next verse says, "He who understands the unreality of all things, and who has laid up no store, his track is unseen like that of birds in the air." This is a very beautiful verse. I'll say it again. "He who understands the unreality of all things, and who has laid up no store, his track is unseen like that of birds in the air." So the unreality of all things. You could say the emptiness of all things. That all things are marked with the three lakshanas. That ultimately they're unsatisfactory, partly or mostly because they are impermanent. But they even go beyond impermanence because they don't have any substantial essence. And once you know those things, what's the point of laying up any store? So this chap, he who understands the unreality of all things and who has laid up no store. So we accumulate, don't we? And yes, I don't know if you've seen a programme, which I do enjoy seeing, which is, confession here, so Dragon's Den. So basically it's about five millionaires, and people come to the Dragon's Den having invented something, and the dragons, these 5 millionaires, decide whether they want to put money into these inventions. So the people come asking for an amount of money. And well, I won't go into why I watch it or why I like what I like about it. But what I will say is it does fascinate me that how somebody could make their whole life around making money. and getting richer and richer and richer. It's quite fascinating because, in a way, you could just see it as a very deep level of ignorance, because they can't take it with them. You know what? I suppose it's very connected with success and fame and so on, but in a way, it's a complete waste of energy, because you can only eat one meal at a time. You can only wear one set of clothes at a time. Uh, you can only live in one house at a time, even if you've got 6 houses. Um, so, laying up store, as it were, is a pointless task. We can't take anything with us, not anything at all, and we can't take any body with us. So we need to learn how to be whole in ourselves, really whole in ourselves, a whole person who thinks for themselves and who is alive in the present moment. What more can I say? His track is unseen, like that of birds in the air. And that's where we fail sometimes, in that we find that hard to not leave any track. We want to leave a track. We want to have mattered. We want to leave our mark. And, well, it just shows how deep our ego is, of wanting to exist, wanting to be somebody, wanting to matter, wanting to pass on our genes and so on. They're very strong drives, aren't they? Yeah. So I better leave it there. I'll see you tomorrow.